For years, Princess Charlotte watched the crown from a distance, too young to rule, too old to be invisible. But on one unforgettable night, inside the golden halls of Versailles, King Charles stood before the world and did something no one expected. In front of presidents, nobles, and the press, he called his granddaughter to the stage and gave her a title lost for centuries, the Duchess of Aquitaine, a title once carried by queens who ruled with courage instead of crowns. This wasn't just a royal gesture, it was the beginning of a legacy reborn. And that's where our story begins. The Hall of Mirrors had learned how to behave around kings. It stood very straight, held its breath, and let light do the talking. Chandeliers softened the space into warm constellations. The parquet gleamed like a sea that had decided to be polite. At one end of the long table, set for the French state banquet, a trio of cameras panned like patient birds, searching for a story that wasn't on the program. Princess Charlotte had been told the word for tonight was poise. She tried it on in the gilded antechamber like a borrowed coat. Chin level, shoulders easy, hands folded at precisely the kind of angle that looks natural from 10 meters away. Her dress was ivory with a thin blue sash, French blue, Aunt Catherine had said with a smile, and her shoes made no sound at all on the floors of Versailles. People looked at her the way grown-ups do when they expect a child to be either cute or awkward. Charlotte obliged by being neither. "2 steps behind me, darling," the Princess of Wales whispered, smoothing an invisible fold from her sash. "And if anyone speaks to you in French, smile first, then say, 'Bonsoir.' No panic." Charlotte nodded. "What if they ask me a question?" "Smile again," her mother said, and the corners of her own mouth agreed. "It works wonders." Beyond the antechamber, voices drifted like music that hadn't decided to be a song yet. Charlotte took a breath and tasted polished wood, perfume, and something older, like pages that were too heavy to turn. She peeked around the doorway. The hall waited, glitteringly indifferent as ushers rehearsed where history would sit. King Charles stood with President Macron beneath an arrangement of lilies that looked like they could keep secrets. The king's shoulders were relaxed in that practiced way that means a person is carrying a nation without letting it see the weight. He leaned in to hear a remark. Camilla watched with the calm of someone who has learned to make public rooms feel private. Charlotte always liked that about her, how she could distract an entire camera crew with a well-placed kindness. "Ready?" the Princess of Wales asked. Charlotte nodded and followed her mother out. Flashbulbs thought about misbehaving, then remembered Versailles was not that kind of room. Strings pulled a tune up from the floor and offered it to the air. The English and the French did their ancient dance of hellos, cheek kisses that were tiny bows, bows that were tiny jokes. Charlotte felt the gaze of 800 years find her and measure her height the way grandparents do against a kitchen doorway. "Bonsoir," she said to a French minister who looked surprised that she had teeth, and smiled at him again for insurance. He laughed, delighted. Her mother's hand found her shoulder for a second that no one else noticed. They moved along the reception line. "Prince Louis is furious," the Princess of Wales murmured behind her smile. "He was promised an eclair." "He would have eaten the chandelier," Charlotte said. "Best for Versailles we left him at home." "Best for the chandelier," her mother agreed, then straightened as an equerry appeared at her elbow with a bow that added its own punctuation to the evening. "Ma'am," he said softly, "His Majesty asks that the princess remain within view during the toasts." "Of course," the Princess of Wales said. "Here or nearer the dais?" nearer," the equerry replied. "He would like her to see the hall when it's quiet." Charlotte glanced over. Her grandfather stood alone for a moment, not by accident but by choreography. He caught her eye and gave the smallest of nods, the kind that says, "I see you," without dragging anyone else into it. She lifted her chin the millimeter that meant, "I'm fine." The banquet began to assemble itself, diplomats seating their ties, ambassadors arranging their faces, cameras and pens pretending to be invisible. A quartet of violinists tested the air with notes that sounded like polite questions. The English and the French took its place as if placing stones across a river. Catherine sat with perfect geometry. William's expression developed its usual crease that made strangers think he was worried when he was only thinking. Charlotte stood at the corner of the dais where she could see the length of the hall, and beyond that, the reflection of the hall seeing itself. She loved reflections. They told the truth about rooms, even when people refused to. In the mirror across from her, Versailles multiplied to infinity, and in the 100th copy of the hall, she could still pick out her own small figure, square of shoulder, ribbon precise, eyes curious in a way that felt like disobedience, but wasn't. She wondered, as children do in palaces, how long a place this large would hold its breath if everyone stopped speaking at once. "Princess Charlotte," the voice said near her shoulder, gently plated with French vowels. An older woman with clever eyes and an enamel brooch in the shape of a tiny bee inclined her head. "Bienvenue. The hall likes courage." "Bonsoir," Charlotte replied, and because the woman's brooch made her think of honey and gardens, she added, "It's very beautiful." "Beauty is easy. Bravery is the work." She nodded towards the dais. "Watch your king. He has brought something heavier than luggage." Charlotte had learned not to ask follow-ups in rooms where answers arrive on velvet. She only smiled and tucked the remark away, like a pebble for a pocket. Dinner gave itself to the usual choreography. Amuse-bouches that looked like tiny jokes, a soup so delicate it apologized for existing, a main course that practiced being remembered. The speeches began their parade. Macron spoke of friendship, courage, the stubborn romance of two nations who adore each other best when disagreeing. The king answered with a story about trees that remember wars and birds that ignore borders. Charlotte liked that one. It sounded like the kind of truth that could be taught to a classroom without causing anyone to look at their shoes. Between courses, Charlotte watched her grandfather's hands. When adults were required to pretend they were not thinking, their hands told on them. Tonight, the king's left thumb traced the edge of his napkin in a circle, a habit I had seen only once, just before he had given his first Christmas speech. Something is coming, she thought, and then told herself not to be dramatic. Palaces made everything sound like a confession. A movement at the far door drew a small intake of air from the footman lining the wall. An elder herald in midnight blue entered, carrying a narrow object wrapped in dark velvet and tied with a ribbon the exact color of an old sky. He did not look around. He walked down the hall past silver and crystal, and men who could end small countries with a phone call, and stopped 3 paces from the king. Camilla's eyes flicked to the bundle and back to the lights. Catherine set down her glass without a sound. William's crease admitted briefly to being worry. Only the violins kept going. The herald bowed and presented the object on his open palms. The king placed his hand over it for a moment, as if testing its temperature. He nodded once. The herald stepped back the precise distance required by dignity and obligation, and the hall remembered how to breathe. "Ladies and gentlemen," the king said, standing, but not raising his glass, which made the words sit up straighter. Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Premier Ministre, friends, thank you for your welcome. We dine tonight in a room that has seen hope learn to walk again after difficult years. It is a good room for promises. Charlotte felt her heart take 2 very fast steps. She did not move. It is also a good room for remembering what we share and for renewing the threads between us that are older than any one of us. He rested his hand on the velvet again, lightly, like a conductor testing the air before raising the baton. This evening, with your courteous permission, I should like to make a small announcement of family, which is also, in its way, an announcement of friendship. Macron smiled the way politicians do when they are delighted to be surprised in public. The cameras found their balance. A footman pretending to be a statue somewhere near the lilies blinked. "Charlotte," the king said, and his voice shifted registers, becoming grandfather inside monarch. "Come here, darling." She did not look at her mother for permission. That would have been childish. She stepped forward, hands together, and mounted the one shallow riser to stand at his side. From here, the hall was a sea, and she could feel the spray of eyes on her face. The velvet bundle was dark enough to swallow the light that dared it. Her grandfather leaned the smallest bit and said, not into a microphone and not for anyone else, "Ready?" "Yes," she said, and meant it. "Since before you were born," he said aloud, now for the room again, "this family has had the habit of keeping its promises by weaving them into names. Some names we pass along like heirlooms, some we retire so they can rest, and some we bring back when the hour and the place are right." He untied the ribbon. It fell into his hand like a line released from a kite. "Tonight, in this house of mirrors," he said, smiling toward Macron, "which kindly reminds us to check how we are seen from both sides, I wish to revive an old and honorable title as a sign not of ownership, but of stewardship, for the old complicities and the new courtesies between our countries, and for a young lady who has shown a remarkable ability to stand very straight without making a show of it." He folded back the velvet. A slim leather case lay within, its corners softened by time, the royal arms impressed on the lid. He opened it. The hall leaned forward. Inside, on ivory paper edged with gold, the letters patent glowed the way words glow when they have been asked to carry too much. Beside the parchment lay a ribboned badge, a small oval of white enamel, encircled by a garland, surmounted by a tiny crown, suspended from a narrow sash of deep blue. Charlotte couldn't read the script from here, but she could see the title where the calligraphy insisted on being generous, Duchess of Aquitaine. She felt the floor find her feet again, as if the hall had been moving and only just now remembered the trick of stillness. The word belonged to maps she had colored at school, to pages about Eleanor riding where kings were afraid to walk, to a history lesson that felt like a story too interesting to be true. Aquitaine. Not a British duchy on any current list, a title from a time when crowns argued over rivers. The murmur that moved through the hall was not the impolite kind. It sounded like recognition. The French delegation sat taller in their chairs. Somewhere in the middle of the room an old man laughed quietly, not mockery, but pleasure. Macron looked briefly, genuinely delighted, then schooled his mouth back into diplomacy. Camilla's eyes softened. Catherine's hand pressed once against her collarbone, as if reminding herself to keep her breathing tidy. "For the avoidance of doubt," the king said, humor finding the corners of his mouth, "this is an honorary style revived as a token of friendship. No claim upon any inch of French soil is implied, promised, or expected." The hall laughed, grateful for the release. But the story between our countries had mothers as well as fathers, and some of those mothers were very brave. It seems right to sew their names into the hem of our present." He lifted the sash, and its small badge. The silk didn't dare rustle. He turned to Charlotte, and in a gesture that was somehow both public and private, tied the short ribbon over the blue of her dress, pinning the enamel oval at her left shoulder. The tiny crown at the top caught the chandelier and held the light like a thought. "Princess Charlotte," he said, and the microphones made the words taller. "In honor of the long friendship between our peoples, in recognition of the generous welcome we have received, and in admiration of your spirit, which your parents assure me is both formidable and well-aimed, I style you tonight, with our family's affection, and as a sign of the stories we keep, Duchess of Aquitaine, honorary and historic, to be given back one day with the same grace with which you accept it." The hall learned how to be quiet the way a forest does right before the first bird. Then the sound rose. Applause at first, civilized, then warmer, then something like a cheer dared itself into existence and was immediately draped in tastefulness. The violins tried to keep up. Macron stood, Camilla stood, William and Catherine stood in the unison that comes from years of practice. The herald's chin quivered with the strain of not smiling. Charlotte stood very still because stillness is how you avoid doing anything that will be on the front of a newspaper tomorrow. Her heart knocked once at the inside of her dress and then decided to be professional. Her grandfather bent and kissed her temple. "Well done," he whispered, and added in the smaller voice only grandchildren receive, "Eleanor would be very cross about the shoes. Otherwise, she'd approve." "You didn't tell me," Charlotte murmured back, the corners of her mouth fighting a losing battle against a grin. "Surprise," he said. "You wore poise like a crown." Catherine reached the dais, eyes bright in a way that made Charlotte suspect this had not been sprung on her entirely without warning. "Your grandfather has always been a little theatrical," she said, fastening the badge more securely. "You did beautifully." William's hand appeared on her shoulder and squeezed. "Formidable and well-aimed," he said wryly. "I told him about the time you negotiated Louis down from 3 puddings to 1. "That was diplomacy," Charlotte said. "This is history." "Same skill set," William said, and for once the crease between his brows admitted it could laugh. Across the room, the woman with the bee brooch lifted her glass toward Charlotte in a salute that seemed to be older than etiquette. Charlotte nodded back. The badge felt lighter than it looked, as if the enamel knew better than to show off. The king signaled to the orchestra, and the music wrapped itself around the moment as neatly as it could. Macron spoke again. Elegant gratitude in both French and English, gifting the evening a remark about Eleanor of Aquitaine's wit that made his speechwriter blush. Camilla began a small conversation with a French actress that drew half the room into a comfortable orbit. The cameras did their well-behaved moving, the pens made their notes, underlining adjectives like courteous and historic and unexpected. Charlotte stood and watched the hall do the thing old rooms do when given a new memory. It tried it on for fit. In the mirrors, the tiny white oval at her shoulder repeated into infinity, a chain of badges down a corridor of time. She imagined one of those reflections stepping out from the glass, the original Duchess perhaps, and rolling her eyes at the modern fuss. Can you ride? Can you read a map without asking the men which way is up? Can you be kind when kindness is not fashionable? Can you keep a secret that doesn't belong to you? "I can try," Charlotte thought. She didn't move her mouth. She answered with her posture. "Duchess," someone said at her elbow, casting the word like a new key. It was the herald, suddenly younger for having allowed himself the smile at last. "You have your first responsibility." "What is it?" Charlotte asked. "Don't trip," he said, deadpan, and she laughed before she could stop herself. "Seriously," he added more softly, "you must drink some water. Titles are thirsty." A footman materialized with a goblet that had seen worse nights. Charlotte took a sip. The water tasted of silver and concentration. Beyond the dais, a small cluster of French schoolchildren, invited for the balcony view, stood in their borrowed good shoes and watched her the way children watch fireworks, alert, skeptical, hoping for something truly outrageous. She gave them a tiny wave. One of the girls, boldest by the cut of her fringe, mimed the pinning of a badge at her own shoulder and then straightened her spine by 3 noticeable centimeters. Charlotte copied the movement, just a fraction. The girl grinned as if entrusted with international secrets. "Poise," Catherine whispered, appearing beside her again, as if conjured by maternal telepathy. "I know," Charlotte whispered back. "I've been practicing." "Not just tonight," Catherine said, and her eyes gathered the last 10 years and folded them into pride. "Ready for the walk?" They stepped down together from the dais to circulate, Charlotte between her parents, the badge catching the light in a way that refused to apologize. They moved past ambassadors who told the same story in accents that made it sound different each time, past a chef who looked like he could cry from relief, past a historian whose face had gone the particular shade of red reserved for men who find their footnotes unexpectedly alive. "Your Royal Highness," he blurted, then corrected himself lightning fast, "Your Grace," and went redder, which Charlotte decided not to notice for his sake. "Eleanor," he said, finally finding words that were safe, "would have approved." "So my grandfather says," Charlotte replied, and allowed herself the smallest mischief. "She would not have approved of my shoes." "History's loss," he said gravely, and bowed himself to safety. They paused near the centerpiece, where lilies continued to keep their counsel. William drifted away to speak to a cluster of veterans who carried their ease like medals. Catherine was claimed by the First Lady for a brief exchange that looked like a friendship auditioning for permanence. For a moment, Charlotte stood alone again. The hall seemed to tilt its ear toward her, just enough to hear a child's quiet comedy of nerves. She turned her head and found the king watching her from across a small sea of diplomats. He raised his glass very slightly. She raised her chin in reply. In the mirror behind him, for a half-second that might have been a trick of the candles, Charlotte thought she saw another figure standing a pace behind her grandfather's reflection, a woman in a gown that had too much history stitched into it, smiling like a person who had learned how to be fearless. The music changed key. The moment exhaled. The king bowed to Macron, Macron bowed to the king. The hall remembered how to gossip graciously without moving its lips. Somewhere, a journalist texted a headline that would be regretfully moderated in 30 minutes. Somewhere else, a little boy announced to his mother that if his sister was a duchess now, he should be in charge of horses. "Not how it works," the mother said, and the hall pretended not to overhear. As dessert arrived, a thing of spun sugar and diplomatic restraint, the Princess of Wales touched Charlotte's arm. "We'll do another round. Then you can breathe without anyone watching." "I've been breathing," Charlotte said, keeping the joke in her throat where it belonged. "It's the room that hasn't." Her mother smiled, the small private one. "Poise," she said again, just to tease. Charlotte nodded and let the word settle on her shoulders along with the tiny weight of the badge. Poise, stewardship, friendship, all of them heavier in the mirror, all of them oddly buoyant in the heart. She took her mother's hand for one step, just one, like a curtain call no one had bought a ticket to, and then let go to walk forward into a room that would, for the rest of her life, remember the exact way the light had landed on her shoulder when a king tied a ribbon and a country tried on an old name to see if it still fit. Behind her on the dais, the empty velvet case lay open like a satisfied secret. Ahead of her, the hall of mirrors replicated her bravery into a future she could not yet see. And somewhere between the mirrors, not quite in the reflection and not entirely out of it. The first chapter of a story found its title. The applause had followed Charlotte all the way back to London. For 3 days, the papers printed her picture in every pose imaginable. The king pinning the sash, the bow to the French president, the tiny badge catching the chandelier. Someone online had slowed the video to count her blinks. Someone else had already made a children's book cover. Charlotte ignored all of it as best she could. Her new title, her grandfather had warned her, came with a noise she couldn't switch off. On the 4th morning, she sat with her mother in the small breakfast room at Windsor. Catherine poured tea, Charlotte stirred sugar she didn't need. "It feels like a story that isn't finished," Charlotte said. "Everyone keeps saying it was historic, but what happens now?" "Now," Catherine said, "you remember that titles are verbs more than nouns. You do the thing, not wear it." "What thing?" "Whatever makes the title mean something again." Her grandfather appeared in the doorway, still in his country jacket, carrying the scent of garden rain. "That," he said, "is the only correct answer. Come on, Duchess. I want to show you something before the rest of the world wakes up." Outside, Windsor's lawns were wet enough to glitter. He led her to a small stone outbuilding she'd never noticed before. Inside were boxes marked Archive, France. He lifted one carefully, set it on a table, and untied the string. Letters lay inside, old paper curled at the edges, French script looping across them like ivy. "Eleanor of Aquitaine kept copies of everything," he said. "Centuries later, someone thought it wise to send us the duplicates. We've been pretending not to know they exist." Charlotte leaned over a page. The ink had browned to the color of tea. A line stood out even to her schoolgirl French. "Le courage se reconnaît par le silence." Courage recognizes itself by silence. "What does it mean?" she asked. "It means you don't have to be loud to matter." He smiled. Eleanor was stubborn enough to remind kings of that. He showed her a small silver seal ring, its surface worn smooth. She used this to sign her last treaty with England. When we revived the duchy name, France returned it quietly to our collection. It arrived this morning. He placed it in her palm. The metal was cold, then warmer. "You see why I wanted you to have a title that was about stories, not land. Borders are for maps. Stories travel better." Charlotte looked down at the ring. "Do I keep it?" "You keep it until you find someone braver than you are. Then you pass it on." She laughed. "That might take a while. That's the idea." Back in the castle, the phones began again, aides moving like purposeful ghosts. There would be statements, portraits, a new charity initiative tied to education in both languages. The king handed those to other hands. "We've had enough speeches for a month," he said. "Let people talk themselves tired." A week later, the royal family made an unannounced visit to a bilingual primary school in South London. Cameras found them anyway. The children, irreverent and practical, asked Charlotte whether a duchess had homework. She assured them she did. When they brought out their French textbooks, she read with them until the teacher's eyes shone. In one of the notebooks, a boy had drawn the Hall of Mirrors and written across it in uneven letters, "Be brave like Charlotte." That evening, scrolling through a flood of headlines she wasn't supposed to read, she found that photograph again. Herself at Versailles, her grandfather's hand on her shoulder. The caption underneath, written by someone who probably hadn't meant to be poetic, read, "A title is a promise if you keep it." The king called after dinner. "How does it feel, Duchess?" "Less like a surprise now, more like homework." He laughed. "The best kind, the kind you choose." "Was it really about France or about us?" "Both. Old friendships need young faces to remind them they're still alive." Outside, the wind moved through the gardens the way applause moves after an encore, soft, reluctant to leave. Charlotte looked out at the lights on the river and thought of the hall's mirrors, the way her reflection had gone on forever. Somewhere down that endless corridor, another version of her might still be standing at the dais, ribbon bright, waiting to learn what courage would mean. She touched the small badge on her desk. Its enamel gleamed like a secret that had decided to trust her. In the morning, there would be lessons, another public smile, another quiet test of poise. For now there was only this, the echo of her grandfather's voice, the ring's cool circle against her palm, and the knowledge that a story once begun never really ends. It simply finds a new keeper.